Welcome to a tale of sweetness and horror. In 1910, something came to Chicago's Blackwood Street, something that wore a man's face but spoke with the voice of 1,000 bees, something that promised perfection through transformation, peace through judgment, and purity through harvest. What you're about to read is a story of supernatural terror set in the gaslit streets of early 20th century Chicago. A macabre tale of a beekeeper whose ambitions went far beyond making honey. If you enjoyed this dark journey into the past, please subscribe and follow for more historical horror tales. Share this with fellow lovers of supernatural stories, and let me know in the comments which episode terrified you most. Now, let us descend into the hive. The autumn of 1910 brought with it an unseasonable warmth to Chicago's west side. And with that warmth came the bees. At first, nobody paid much attention to Silas Crow when he moved into the dilapidated Victorian at the end of Blackwood Street. The house had stood empty for 3 years, following the mysterious death of its previous owner, and the neighbors were simply relieved that someone had finally taken an interest in the property, even if that someone was as peculiar as Mr. Crow. Detective Thomas Halloway first heard about the new resident from his wife, Margaret, over breakfast one crisp October morning. Their brownstone sat just 4 houses down from the Victorian, close enough for Margaret to have developed opinions about their new neighbor. "He's quite odd, Thomas," she said, buttering her toast with deliberate strokes. "Always dressed in that strange white suit, even when he's working in the garden. And the humming, Lord, the humming never stops." Thomas looked up from his copy of the Chicago Tribune, his graying mustache twitching with mild interest. After 20 years with the police department, he'd learned that odd was a relative term in a city as diverse and volatile as Chicago. What sort of humming? Constantly. A low, droning sound. Mrs. Patterson says she can hear it through her bedroom wall at night. Says it's like having a motor car engine idling next door. Perhaps he's a musician, Thomas suggested, returning to an article about the ongoing labor disputes at the stockyards. Or perhaps Mrs. Patterson should mind her own affairs. But Margaret was not to be deterred. "He keeps bees, Thomas. Dozens of hives in that overgrown garden of his. The Johansson's boy, little Peter, wandered too close to the fence last week and came home covered in stings. His mother is beside herself." This caught Thomas's attention. He'd seen what bee venom could do to a child, particularly one who might be sensitive to it. "Is the boy all right?" "Oh, yes, though he was quite swollen for a few days." But here's the strange part. When Mrs. Johansson went to speak with Mr. Crow about it, he was standing in the middle of his garden without a veil or gloves, absolutely covered in bees. They were crawling over his face, his hands, even going in and out of his mouth, and he was just standing there, humming that infernal tune. Thomas set down his newspaper. "She's certain of this?" "She swears it. Said it was the most unnatural thing she'd ever witnessed. The bees seemed to be dancing around him, moving in patterns." That afternoon, Thomas found himself walking past the Victorian on his way home from the precinct. It was a magnificent structure, or had been once, 3 stories of weathered gray stone with ornate cornices, and a tower that rose like a finger pointing at heaven. The windows were dark despite the early evening hour, their glass so thick with grime that no light penetrated from within. The garden was indeed overgrown, a wild tangle of dead flowers and creeping vines. But among the decay, Thomas could see the hives, at least 20 of them, maybe more, arranged in precise geometric patterns throughout the space. Even in the cooling October air, he could hear the humming Margaret had described. It emanated from the hives like a living thing, a bass note that seemed to vibrate in his chest. As he stood there, the front door opened. Silas Crow was a tall man, perhaps 6.5 feet, with a gaunt frame that seemed to fold in on itself like a collapsing umbrella. His face was long and sallow, all sharp angles and hollow spaces, with eyes that were an unsettling shade of yellow-brown, like amber or honey held up to the light. His white suit, as Margaret had described, was immaculate, despite the obvious squalor of his surroundings. "Detective Halloway," Crow said, his voice a soft rasp. "I've been expecting you." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Have we met, Mr. Crow?" No, but the bees told me you would come. Crow smiled, revealing teeth that seemed just slightly too long for his mouth. They know everyone on this street. They know their routines, their secrets, their fears. Would you like to come in? I've just made every instinct Thomas had developed over 2 decades of police work told him to decline, to tip his hat politely and continue on his way. But there was something compelling about Crow, something that drew him forward despite his reservations. The interior of the house was even stranger than its exterior. The furniture was sparse, a few chairs, a table, an old settee, but every surface was covered in honeycomb. It dripped from the walls, hung from the ceiling in golden stalactites, pooled in the corners like amber sap. The sweet smell was overwhelming, cloying, almost narcotic in its intensity. "Forgive the mess," Crow said, leading Thomas through to what had once been a parlor. "The girls are quite productive. I can barely keep up with their output." "The girls?" "My bees. All workers are female, you know. The drones, the males, they serve only one purpose, and once they've fulfilled it, the hive has no more use for them. A harsh system, perhaps, but efficient. Nature cares nothing for sentiment." Thomas sat in the offered chair, trying not to stare at a particularly large section of honeycomb that appeared to be pulsing slightly, as if breathing. "Mr. Crow, I've had reports about your bees. There was an incident with a neighbor's child." "Ah, yes, young Peter Johansson. A curious boy. He's been watching me through the fence for weeks now. The bees were merely introducing themselves. He was stung quite badly. Pain is an excellent teacher, Detective. I'm sure Peter has learned to respect boundaries." Crow poured tea from a pot that seemed to be made of wax, the liquid itself thick and golden. "Though I did send Mrs. Johansson some honey as an apology, a special variety. I assured her it would help with the swelling." Thomas left the tea untouched. "Where are you from, Mr. Crow? Your accent isn't local." "Oh, I've been many places. The Carpathians, for a time. The Greek islands. Ancient Egypt, if you can believe that." He laughed, a dry, sound like paper rustling. "But recently, I've been in New Orleans. Have you ever been to New Orleans, Detective?" "Can't say that I have. A fascinating place. They understand things there that the rest of America has forgotten. The old knowledge, the old ways." Crow leaned forward, his amber eyes catching the dying light from the window. "Did you know that ancient Egyptian priests used bees in their embalming process? The honey preserved the flesh, but it also preserved something else, the essence of the deceased, their memories, their souls, trapped forever in sweetness." Thomas stood abruptly. "Mr. Crow, I'm going to have to ask you to ensure your bees don't pose a danger to the neighborhood if there are any more incidents." "There won't be," Crow interrupted, rising as well. His smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of cold intensity. "Not unless they deserve it. The bees are excellent judges of character, Detective. They sense wickedness, corruption, lies. This street has more than its share of secrets, don't you think?" As Thomas left, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. On the wall by the door, arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, were dozens of dead bees. No, not dead. As he looked closer, he could see their legs still twitching, their wings still attempting to flutter. They'd been pinned there, alive, forming letters. A message. It read, "Judgment comes." Over the following week, Blackwood Street began to change in subtle ways that Thomas couldn't quite articulate but felt in his bones. The humming from Crow's garden grew louder, more persistent, often continuing through the night. Neighbors who had once been friendly became withdrawn, suspicious. Arguments broke out over trivial matters. Old grudges resurfaced. And the bees were everywhere. They appeared at windows, clustered around doorways, investigated the contents of trash bins. Thomas found them in his own home, crawling across his shaving mirror, exploring the sugar bowl, drowning themselves in Margaret's perfume bottles. When he mentioned it to his colleagues at the precinct, several admitted to similar experiences. "It's the warm weather," Officer Danny Morrison suggested during their morning briefing, "keeping them active longer than usual." But Thomas had lived through many warm autumns in Chicago, and he'd never seen anything like this. The bees seemed purposeful, directed, as if they were searching for something specific. It was Margaret who first accepted Crow's honey. Thomas came home one evening to find her spooning it into her tea with a dreamy expression on her face. The honey was unlike any he'd ever seen, almost luminescent, with swirls of different colors moving through it like oil on water. "Margaret, where did you get that?" "Mr. Crow brought it by this afternoon." "Wasn't that kind of him?" "He said it was a housewarming gift, though I suppose it's a bit late for that." She took a sip of her tea and closed her eyes in apparent bliss. "Thomas, you must try some. It's extraordinary." "No." The word came out sharper than he'd intended. "Margaret, we're not eating anything from that man." She looked at him with surprise. Then something darker, anger, perhaps, or resentment. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just honey, and it's helping with my headaches. I've had such terrible headaches lately, haven't I? But since I started taking the honey, they've disappeared entirely." Thomas wanted to snatch the jar away, to throw it in the trash, but something stopped him. Margaret was right about the headaches. She'd been suffering from them for months, severe migraines that left her bedridden for days. If Crow's honey genuinely helped, over the next few days, Thomas watched as his wife became increasingly obsessed with the honey. She took it with every meal, dissolved it in her tea, sometimes ate it straight from the jar with a spoon. Her behavior changed subtly. She became more secretive, more prone to staring out windows for long periods, and several times he caught her humming that same droning tune that emanated from Crow's garden. But the Halloways weren't alone. Thomas began to notice jars of the luminescent honey in homes throughout the neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson had it in her kitchen. The Johansons kept a jar prominently displayed on their dining table, despite their son's recent bee stings. Even stern old Mr. Kowalski, who'd lived on Blackwood Street for 40 years and trusted no one, had accepted a jar. "It's medicinal, Mr. Kowalski explained when Thomas asked. "Helps with my arthritis. Haven't felt this good in years." Thomas couldn't argue with the results. Everyone who consumed the honey seemed healthier, more energetic. Mrs. Patterson's chronic cough had disappeared. Young Peter Johansson's asthma had improved dramatically. Even Margaret looked younger somehow, the lines around her eyes softening, her hair regaining its former luster. But there was something else, something that Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on. The honey eaters, as he'd begun thinking of them, had a glassy quality to their eyes, a certain vacancy in their expressions. And they all hummed, whether they realized it or not, that same low, droning note. His concerns deepened when he ran into Dr. Abraham Rosenthal, the neighborhood physician, outside the corner pharmacy. "Thomas, a word?" "Doctor." Rosenthal pulled him aside, his usually jovial face grave. "Have you noticed anything unusual about our neighbors lately?" "Define unusual." "I've been making my rounds, and there's something wrong, physiologically wrong. Several patients have shown me unusual growths, small, hexagonal patterns on their skin, like scarring, but arranged too perfectly to be natural. And their blood." He lowered his voice. "I took samples from Mrs. Chen last week. Under the microscope, the blood cells were moving in formation, Thomas, arranged in geometric patterns. It's impossible, but I saw it with my own eyes." "Have they all been eating Crow's honey?" Dr. Rosenthal nodded slowly. "Every last one. I tried to get samples of the honey for testing, but..." He trailed off, looking embarrassed. "But what?" "I couldn't bring myself to take it. Every time I reached for the jar, I felt this overwhelming urge to taste it instead. It's in my head now, Thomas. The humming. I hear it even when I'm miles away from this neighborhood." That night, Thomas decided to investigate Crow's property more thoroughly. He waited until well after midnight, when the street was dark and silent, save for that eternal humming. Using his spare key, he let himself out the back door and made his way through the shadows to the Victorian's fence. The garden was alive with movement, despite the late hour. Bees crawled over every surface, their bodies catching moonlight and reflecting it back in fractured rainbow patterns. The hives themselves seemed to pulse with internal light, as if something was burning inside them. And in the center of it all stood Silas Crow. He was completely naked, his pale skin almost luminescent in the darkness. Bees covered him from head to toe, so thick in places that he appeared to be wearing armor made of living insects. His arms were outstretched, his head thrown back, and from his open mouth came that humming, louder now, deeper, a sound that Thomas felt in his teeth and bones. As Thomas watched, frozen with a mixture of horror and fascination, the bees began to lift Crow off the ground. It was impossible, defied every law of physics, but he rose slowly into the air, supported by thousands of small wings, until he hovered 6 feet above the garden. The bees moved in waves across his body, and Thomas realized with sickening certainty that they were going inside him, crawling into his mouth, his nose, his ears, as if they were filling him up, replacing what was human with something else entirely. Thomas must have made some sound, because Crow's head suddenly snapped toward him. Those amber eyes opened, but they weren't eyes anymore. They were compound, multifaceted, insectal. And when Crow smiled, his mouth opened far too wide, revealing not teeth but a honeycomb interior, dripping with golden liquid. Detective Halloway. Crow's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, as if the bees themselves were speaking. How good of you to join us. We've been preparing something special. A gift for Blackwood Street. For all of Chicago, eventually. But this street first. This street must be cleansed. Thomas ran. He crashed through his back door, locked it behind him, and stood in his dark kitchen, heart-hammering, trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but reality. But when he finally worked up the courage to look out his window toward Crow's garden, he could still see that pale figure hanging in the air, suspended by impossible means, conducting an orchestra of insects in some terrible symphony. The next morning, Thomas tried to speak to Margaret about what he'd witnessed, but she wouldn't listen. She was in the kitchen, humming that tune, spreading Crow's honey on toast with methodical precision. "Margaret, please, you have to stop eating that honey. Something is wrong with it." Something is wrong with Crow. She looked at him with those glassy eyes, and for a moment he didn't recognize his wife of 23 years. "Nothing is wrong, Thomas. Everything is perfect. Mr. Crow is helping us. He's making us better, pure. You should try the honey. It would help you understand." Understand what? That we've been living wrong. That this whole street, this whole city, has been living wrong. But Mr. Crow is going to fix it. He's going to fix all of us. Thomas spent the day at the precinct, trying to focus on his work, but finding his thoughts continually drawn back to Blackwood Street. He considered filing a second report, but what would he say? That his neighbor could float on bees? That honey was making people act strangely? He'd be laughed out of the department, possibly suspended for mental health evaluation. Instead, he decided to do some research. The police library had an extensive collection of books on various subjects, including a surprising number on occult practices. If there was something supernatural happening, and Thomas was increasingly convinced there was, perhaps he could find some explanation, some precedent. What he found chilled him to his core. In a dusty volume on ancient Egyptian magic, he discovered references to bee priests mystics who claimed to commune with their hives, using them as vessels for souls of the dead. According to the text, these priests believed that bees were intermediaries between the living and the dead, that their honey could trap spirits, and their stings could deliver judgments from the gods. Another book, this one on European folklore, mentioned bee masters, who supposedly could control their swarms with supernatural precision, using them to punish enemies or enforce their will on entire villages. Several accounts described mysterious deaths in medieval Germany, where victims were found encased in beeswax, their bodies perfectly preserved, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. But it was a slim journal from a New Orleans occult society that provided the most disturbing information. Written in 1902, it described a practitioner named Silas Crow who had been expelled from the society for dangerous experimentation with apian necromancy. The journal claimed that Crow had developed a method of infusing honey with a quest, compound that made it supernaturally addictive, while gradually transforming the consumer's blood into a substance more palatable to his swarm. The journal ended with a warning. Should Silas Crow resurface, he must be stopped by any means necessary. His goal, he once confessed, is to create a mesrescent, City of the dead, a place where every soul has been claimed by his bees, where every body serves as a hive for his growing swarm. Thomas closed the journal with shaking hands. It was 1910, 8 years after that warning had been written, and Silas Crow was living on his street, feeding his neighbors poisoned honey, transforming them into something inhuman. He had to act. But what could one man do against something like this? The answer came sooner than Thomas expected, and in a form he could never have anticipated. It started with Mr. Patterson, 3 houses down. Thomas heard the screams around 3 in the morning, terrible, agonized wails that seemed to go on forever. By the time he'd thrown on clothes and rushed outside, half the street was already gathered on the Pattersons' lawn, still in their nightclothes, humming that infernal tune even as they stared up at the second-floor window where the screams originated. Thomas pushed through the crowd, his neighbors, people he'd known for years, but who now looked at him with strange, vacant expressions, and forced his way into the house. Mrs. Patterson stood at the bottom of the stairs, humming, her face serene, despite her husband's agony echoing from above. "Mrs. Patterson, what's happened? Is your husband all right?" She turned to him slowly, and Thomas saw that her eyes had taken on a golden hue, like honey held up to sunlight. "He's being judged," she said simply. "Mr. Crow said the bees would know. They always know." Thomas took the stairs 2 at a time, following the screams to the bedroom. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mr. Patterson was on the bed, convulsing, his body covered in bees. But these weren't simply stinging him, they were burrowing into his flesh, disappearing into his skin like it was water. His mouth was open in a continuous scream, and bees poured from his throat, carrying with them pieces of something dark and wet. "Oh, God," Thomas breathed, backing toward the door. "Oh, dear God." But Patterson's eyes found him, and in them, Thomas saw a desperate, terrible clarity. The man's hand reached out, trembling, and he managed to choke out a single word: deserved. Then his body arched one final time, and from every orifice, mouth, nose, ears, eyes, bees emerged in a torrent. They filled the room in seconds, a living storm of insects that forced Thomas back out into the hallway. When the swarm finally settled, drifting back toward Crow's property like they'd been called home, Patterson was dead, his body deflated, hollow, nothing left inside but honeycomb. Thomas stood there, shaking, staring at the impossibility before him, until he heard footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Patterson appeared, still humming, still serene. "He was a wicked man," she said matter-of-factly. "He beat me. For years. I hid the bruises well, but the bees knew. Mr. Crow says, the bees always know. This is justice, Detective. This is what this street needs." Thomas called the precinct, but even as he did so, he knew it was futile. What could he tell them? A man had been killed by bees, hollowed out and filled with honeycomb. They'd think he'd lost his mind, but the body was real enough, impossible as it was. By dawn, the house was swarming with police, the coroner, and curious onlookers. Dr. Rosenthal performed a preliminary examination, and his face went gray. "Thomas, I don't even know how to describe this in my report." His entire internal structure has been replaced. There's honeycomb where his organs should be, and there's something else. The comb is full, not with honey, but with memories. Memories? I can see images in the wax, faces, places, moments from his life. It's like the bees extracted his consciousness and stored it. Dr. Rosenthal looked ill. "How is this possible?" Thomas pulled him aside, away from the other officers. "Abraham, you need to leave this street. Tonight. Pack up your family. And go. Something terrible is happening here, and it's only going to get worse. I can't just leave my patients. Your patients are already lost. Look at them." Thomas gestured toward the crowd that had gathered outside the Patterson house. They stood in perfect rows, swaying slightly, all humming in unison. And among them, at the back, stood Silas Crow in his immaculate white suit, watching the chaos with those terrible amber eyes and a slight smile on his gaunt face. As Thomas watched, Crow raised one long-fingered hand and made a small gesture. The crowd's humming increased in volume, became almost painful in its intensity, and then they simply turned and walked away, moving as one organism back to their homes. All except Margaret. Thomas's wife remained on the lawn, standing perfectly still, staring at Crow with an expression of rapt devotion. When Thomas called her name, she didn't respond. Only when Crow nodded to her did she finally turn and walk back to their house. And the look she gave Thomas as she passed him was one of complete indifference, as if he were a stranger. That evening, Thomas sat in his study, the door locked, trying to formulate a plan. He tried to convince the other officers that something supernatural was happening, but they dismissed his concerns. Patterson's death had been ruled a bizarre accident, possibly some kind of allergic reaction that had caused hallucinations in witnesses. The honeycomb inside the body was being dismissed as a stress-induced misidentification by Dr. Rosenthal, who was now being pressured to amend his initial report. They didn't want to see the truth. Or perhaps, Thomas thought with growing dread, some of them had already been compromised. Had any of his fellow officers been eating Crow's honey? A knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas? Margaret's voice, but different somehow, flatter. Mr. Crow would like to speak with you. He's waiting in the parlor. Thomas's hand went to his service revolver. Tell him I'm not interested. He says it's important. He says you're the only one on the street who hasn't been judged yet. He says it's time. The humming started then, coming from everywhere, from Margaret outside the door, from the walls themselves, from deep in the foundations of the house. It grew louder and louder until Thomas had to cover his ears. But it didn't help. The sound was inside his head now, resonating in his bones. He threw open the door to find Margaret standing there, but she wasn't alone. The hallway behind her was full of his neighbors, the entire street, it seemed, packed into his house, all humming that terrible tune. Their eyes were all golden now, all reflecting that same unnatural light. And at the end of the hallway, standing at the top of the stairs, was Silas Crow, Detective Halloway. His voice cut through the humming like a knife. We need to talk about your sins. Thomas raised his revolver, but before he could pull the trigger. Margaret grabbed his arm with supernatural strength. Her skin was hot, feverish, and through her nightgown, he could see hexagonal patterns etched into her flesh, glowing faintly gold. Don't fight it, she whispered. The judgment is a gift. It cleanses, it purifies. Let the bees show you the truth. They came then, pouring through the windows, through the cracks in the walls, through the chimney, and under the doors. Thousands of them, filling the house with their bodies, their wings creating a deafening roar. Thomas felt them landing on him, crawling across his face, exploring his ears, his nose, seeking entry. And in that moment of pure terror, Thomas understood. This was just the beginning. Patterson had been a test, a demonstration. Crow was planning something far worse. He was going to judge the entire street, cleanse it with his bees, hollow out every sinner, and fill them with his terrible honeycomb justice. With a strength born of desperation, Thomas tore free from Margaret's grip and ran. He crashed down the stairs, through the swarm, through his neighbors, who reached for him with golden-eyed devotion. Bees stung him, but he barely felt it. His entire being focused on escape. He burst through the front door and onto Blackwood Street, gasping, disoriented, covered in welts. The street lamps had gone out, leaving only the pale light from windows filled with swaying, humming figures. And from every house, from every door and window, bees were emerging. Not hundreds or thousands, but millions, forming clouds that blotted out the stars, a living darkness that spread across the neighborhood like a plague. Thomas ran, not toward the main streets where he might find help, but toward Crow's house. If there was any hope of stopping this, of saving Margaret and the others, he had to confront the source. He had to destroy whatever unholy thing Silas Crow had become. The gate to the Victorian's garden stood open, inviting. The gate humming here was so loud it was almost solid. a wall of sound that made Thomas's vision blur and his stomach turn. But he pushed forward, past the hives, past the dead flowers, toward the back door that stood ajar. Inside, the house had transformed. Every surface was covered in honeycomb now, layer upon layer of it, creating organic tunnels and chambers. The air was thick with sweetness and something else, the smell of rot, of decay masked by sugar. "Welcome, Detective," Crow's voice echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. "I was wondering when you'd come." The others were easy, their sins obvious, their guilt weighing them down. But you've been more difficult to read. Thomas followed the voice through the honeycomb corridors, his revolver held before him like a talisman. The walls here were different. The honeycomb was filled not with honey, but with something darker, thicker, and within the cells he could see preserved things, human things, fingers, eyes, tongues, all suspended in amber, all perfectly preserved. "Do you know why I chose Blackwood Street?" Crow continued, his voice closer now. "It's a nexus, Detective. A place where sin has accumulated over decades. Every cruel word, every hidden crime, every secret violence they soak into the ground and poison the air. The bees can sense it. They told me this street needed cleansing." Thomas entered what had once been the parlor, but was now a throne room of sorts, with walls of honeycomb rising 30 feet to a ceiling he couldn't see. In the center sat Silas Crow, but he was barely human now. His body had merged with a massive hive, his torso opened to reveal chambers full of bees, his arms ending not in hands but in pulsing egg sacs. His face was the only part that remained recognizably human, though his smile revealed that terrible honeycomb interior. "What are you?" Thomas breathed. "I am the judgment," Crow replied. "I am the cleansing fire, the purging flood, the plague that strips away sin. The bees are my angels, Detective. And honey is my holy water. And soon, this entire city will know purity." "You're insane." "Am I?" Crow's laugh was like wind through 1,000 hollow reeds. "Tell me, Detective Thomas Halloway, husband to Margaret, father to a daughter you haven't seen in 5 years, are you without sin? Should you be spared the judgment?" Thomas felt his blood run cold. "How do you know about?" "The bees know everything. They told me about your daughter, Sarah, how you drove her away with your temper, your impossible standards, your cruelty disguised as discipline. She writes to your wife, but you've forbidden Margaret from responding. Your daughter could be dying, could be desperate for reconciliation, and you're too proud, too stubborn to admit you were wrong." Every word was a sting, and Thomas felt his grip on the revolver loosening. "And poor Margaret," Crow continued, 23 years of marriage to a man who's become cold, distant, more devoted to his work than to her. She's been so lonely, Detective. The honey gave her comfort, purpose, belonging. More than you've given her in years." "Stop it." "Why? Because the truth hurts? Because facing your sins is painful? That's what the judgment is for, Detective. To force us to confront what we are, to strip away the lies we tell ourselves, and to either be purified or destroyed." Thomas raised the revolver, aimed at Crow's too human face. "I'm ending this. Now, by all means, try." The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Thomas saw the bullet strike Crow directly between the eyes, saw his head snap back from the impact. But instead of blood, honey poured from the wound, thick and golden. And from that honey came bees, dozens of them, then hundreds, swarming toward Thomas with murderous intent. He fired again and again, but each bullet only released more bees. They covered him in seconds, stinging repeatedly, and Thomas felt his knees buckle as venom flooded his system. The world spun, and he collapsed onto the honeycomb floor. As consciousness faded, he heard Crow's voice one last time. "The judgment has begun, Detective. For you, for this street, for all of Chicago. None shall be spared. None shall remain unchanged. And in the end, when every sin has been extracted and every soul has been weighed, this city will be pure. It will be perfect. It will be mine. The last thing Thomas saw before darkness claimed him was the ceiling opening like a flower, revealing chamber upon chamber of honeycomb, each cell containing a trapped soul, a stolen memory, a life reduced to sweetness and wax. And above it all, suspended in honey and horror, were the missing people of Chicago. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps. All the unexplained disappearances from the past decade, all perfectly preserved, all screaming silently behind their amber prisons. The humming was the last thing to fade. That terrible, eternal drone that was both prayer, dirge, promise, and threat. The judgment had begun. Thomas Halloway opened his eyes to darkness and sweetness. For a confused moment, he thought he was still in his bed, having experienced the most vivid nightmare of his life. But the surface beneath him wasn't his mattress. It was too firm, too textured, with a slight give like organic matter. And the smell, that overwhelming scent of honey, so thick it was almost suffocating. He tried to sit up and found his body wouldn't respond properly. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if they'd been filled with lead. When he finally managed to raise his hand to his face, he felt something crusty and hard covering his skin. In the darkness, he couldn't see what it was, but his fingers told him the truth, beeswax. His entire body had been coated in a thin layer of it, partially mummifying him. Memory flooded back. Crow, the swarm, the bullets that unleashed bees instead of blood, the honeycomb chambers filled with trapped souls, the judgment. Where was he? How long had he been unconscious? Thomas forced himself to move, breaking through the wax coating with painful cracks that echoed in the enclosed space. He was in some kind of cell, roughly 6 feet by 4, with walls that felt like honeycomb when he touched them. Above him, maybe 8 feet up, was a dim light source, not electric or gas, but a pale phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Hello?" His voice came out as a croak. "Is anyone there? Detective Halloway?" The response came from nearby, though Thomas couldn't tell from which direction. The honeycomb walls seemed to transmit sound oddly, making it echo and multiply. "Thank God! I thought you might be dead." "Who's that?" "Dr. Rosenthal. Abraham. I'm in the cell next to yours, I think. Or above. It's hard to tell in this place. How long have I been here?" "3 days," came another voice. This one younger, trembling. 3 days since they brought you in. I've been keeping count by the feeding times." "Feeding times?" Thomas felt his stomach lurch. "They bring us honey," Dr. Rosenthal explained, his voice bitter. "Twice a day. It drips through small holes in the ceiling. We're supposed to drink it. Some of us do. Some of us." He trailed off. "What happens if you don't drink it?" A long pause. Then a woman's voice, weak and raspy. "You start to dry out, like you're being preserved from the inside. The first day, you're just thirsty. The second day, your skin starts to crack. By the third day, you can feel yourself hardening, turning into something else." Thomas felt along the walls of his cell more carefully now, searching for any weakness, any way out. His fingers found seams, edges where hexagonal cells had been fitted together, but they were sealed tight with some kind of resinous substance. "How many of us are there?" he asked. "I've counted at least 20 voices," Dr. Rosenthal replied. "But there might be more. Some stopped talking days ago. And there are the silent ones, the cells that glow differently, where we can see shadows moving, but no one responds when we call out. The already judged," the young voice added. "That's what Mrs. Patterson calls them. She's been judged. She doesn't talk to us anymore, just hums." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Mrs. Patterson is here? Cell down and to the left, I think," Dr. Rosenthal said. "But she's not herself anymore. None of the judged are. They've accepted it, welcomed it. They're becoming part of the hive." As if summoned by the mention, the humming started. It began with one voice, that terrible, droning tune, and then spread from cell to cell like a contagion. Thomas pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound came through the walls, through his bones, a vibration that made his teeth ache. "Make it stop!" someone screamed. "Please, make it stop!" But it didn't stop. For what felt like hours, the humming continued, until Thomas thought he might go mad from it. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased. In the silence that followed, Thomas heard something else. Footsteps, slow, measured, approaching through what sounded like corridors beyond their cells. "He's coming," Dr. Rosenthal whispered. "Crow. He visits us every day, talks to us about our sins, about the judgment. Thomas, don't listen to him. Don't let him inside your head." But Thomas had no choice. A moment later, a section of his cell wall became transparent, revealing the corridor beyond. And there, dressed in his immaculate white suit, despite the organic horror surrounding him, stood Silas Crow. He looked more human than the last time Thomas had seen him, though his amber eyes still glowed with that unnatural light. Behind him, the corridor walls pulsed with life, veins of honey flowing through the honeycomb, and within some cells, Thomas could see the preserved figures of those who'd been completely absorbed by the judgment. "Good morning, Detective," Crow said pleasantly. "I'm glad to see you're awake. You've been through quite an ordeal." "Where's my wife?" Thomas demanded. "What have you done to Margaret?" "Your wife is safe. Better than safe, she's been elevated." Margaret was one of the first to accept the judgment willingly, and for that, she's been granted a position of honor in the new order. Crow smiled. "Would you like to see her?" Before Thomas could respond, another wall of his cell became transparent. Beyond it was a chamber, and suspended within it, encased in amber up to her neck, was Margaret. Her eyes were open, golden and vacant, and from her open mouth, bees crawled in and out like she was breathing them. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, "what have you done to her?" "I've made her pure," Crow replied. "All her pain, all her loneliness, all the small cruelties she endured from you, they've been extracted and stored. She's empty now, hollow, a perfect vessel for the Jame. Hive. She feels no pain, knows no suffering. Isn't that merciful?" Thomas threw himself at the transparent wall, pounding on it with his fists, but it didn't even crack. "You monster! You'll pay for this!" "Will I?" Crow cocked his head, an eerily insectile gesture. "And who will make me pay, Detective? Your fellow officers? They're already drinking the honey. Half the precinct has been compromised. Or perhaps the mayor? The governor? Do you know how far my reach extends?" He gestured, and more walls became transparent, revealing cell after cell, chamber after chamber. Thomas saw people he recognized, city officials, businessmen, society ladies, even a judge he'd appeared before countless times, all trapped, all awaiting judgment. "This isn't just about Blackwood Street anymore," Crow continued. "It never was. The street was merely a test, a proof of concept. But Chicago? Chicago is ready for harvest. The city is rotten with sin, Detective. The corruption in your government, the violence in your streets, the exploitation of the poor by the rich. It's all poison, and I am the cure. You're insane. Perhaps. Or perhaps I'm the only sane thing in an insane world." Crow leaned closer to the transparent wall. "Tell me, Detective, what did you feel when you put that bullet in me? Satisfaction? Righteousness? Or did some part of you enjoy it? Did some dark corner of your soul relish the thought of taking a life, even a monstrous one like mine?" Thomas said nothing. "That darkness is what I'm trying to eliminate. The capacity for violence, for cruelty, for sin, it's all stored in the blood, in the flesh, in the very fibers of what makes us human. But the bees can extract it. They can pull out every wicked thought, every cruel impulse, every sin, and store it safely away in honeycomb where it can never hurt anyone again." "You're talking about destroying what makes people human. Am I? Or am I simply removing the worst parts and leaving the best?" Crow smiled. "By the end of the week, Detective, 1,000 people in Chicago will have consumed my honey. By the end of the month, 10,000. And each one will become a vector, spreading my gift to others. Within a year, the entire city will be cleansed. And then we move on to the next city, and the next, until the whole world is pure. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Detective? Your daughter Sarah. She's in San Francisco. I've already sent her a gift, a jar of my special honey, with a note from her dear mother begging her to try it. By the time she tastes it, she'll already be mine. You'll never see her again, at least not as you remember her. She'll be cleansed, purified, made perfect. Just like Margaret. Thomas roared and threw himself at the wall again, but Crow simply walked away, his footsteps echoing through the honeycomb corridors until they faded entirely. For hours after Crow's visit, Thomas sat in his cell, fighting despair. His wife was gone, transformed into some kind of living hive. His daughter was being targeted, and he was trapped in this organic prison with no way out and no hope of rescue. But then, Doctor, Rosenthal's voice came through the wall. Thomas, are you still there? I'm here. Don't let him break you. That's what he wants, to make us despair, to make us accept the judgment willingly. But there's something he doesn't know. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to hear better. What? The honey. The one they've been feeding us. I've been analyzing it, or at least analyzing what I can taste. It's not the same as what he was distributing on the street. This batch is different, weaker. I think he's trying to keep us docile without fully transforming us yet. Why would he do that? Because he needs something from us first. Our consent, maybe? Or our complete psychological breakdown? I'm not sure. But the point is, we're not fully compromised yet. We can still resist. And how exactly do we do that? Thomas asked bitterly. We're trapped in honeycomb cells with no tools, no weapons, and no way out. Actually, a new voice joined the conversation, the young man who'd spoken earlier. There might be a way. My name is Peter Chen. I'm a chemist. Well, I was studying to be one before all this. And I've noticed something about these cells. What's that? They're organic, living, which means they can be killed. Thomas felt a spark of hope. Go on. The honey they feed us isn't just food, it's also maintenance. It keeps the walls supple, alive. But if we stop consuming it, if we let ourselves dehydrate slightly, our sweat would change composition, become more acidic. Over time, that acidity could weaken the walls. But you said people who don't drink the honey start to mummify, Thomas pointed out. They do. So we'd have to find a balanced drink just enough to stay alive, but not so much that we feed the walls. It would be painful, dangerous, but it might give us a chance. Dr. Rosenthal spoke up. It would take time, days, maybe weeks, and not everyone would survive the attempt. Do we have a better option? Thomas asked. Silence. Then, one by one, voices from other cells began to respond. Some agreed to try. Others were too afraid, too broken, and some, like Mrs. Patterson and the others who'd been judged, simply hummed in response, their humanity already gone. Over the following days, Thomas and the others who'd agreed to the plan began their careful resistance. When the honey dripped through the ceiling holes, they caught only a small amount in their cupped hands, enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. The deprivation was immediate and brutal. Thomas's mouth felt like sand, his lips cracking and bleeding. His head pounded with dehydration, and his skin began to feel tight, papery. But Dr. Rosenthal had been right. The walls of his cell began to change. The honeycomb that had been firm and resilient began to soften slightly, to sag. When Thomas pressed against it, he could feel a give that hadn't been there before. Not everyone managed as well. On the fourth day, one of the prisoners, a woman named Elizabeth Morrow, began screaming that she couldn't take it anymore. They heard her cell open, heard Crow's soothing voice, offering her relief, offering her the judgment. Her screams turned to sobs, then to silence, and finally, to that terrible humming that marked the end of resistance. Stay strong, Doctor. Rosenthal urged the rest of them. We're making progress. I can feel my walls weakening. Another few days, and we might be able to break through. But they didn't have a few more days. On the 5th day, the structure around them began to change. The walls vibrated with activity. The humming grew louder, and through the transparent sections of their cells, they could see worker bees swarming through the corridors, carrying materials, building new chambers. "What's happening?" Peter Chen. Peter Chen. Peter Chen. Peter Chen. Peter Chen called out. "He's expanding," Dr. Rosenthal replied, his voice tight with fear. "The hive is growing, spreading. God help us. I think he's ready to start the harvest." That night, though, it was hard to tell night from day in the honeycomb prison. Crow returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked Margaret, or what remained of her. She was no longer encased in amber, but moving freely, dressed in a white robe that mirrored Crow's suit. Her skin had taken on a waxy quality, and when she moved, Thomas could see shapes moving beneath her flesh bees. He realized with horror, living inside her body. "Margaret?" His voice broke. "Can you hear me?" She turned toward his cell, and for a moment, Thomas thought he saw recognition in those golden eyes. But then she smiled, and it was a stranger's smile, empty and serene. She said, her voice harmonizing with a subtle buzz. "I've come to offer you a gift, the same gift I've received. No more pain, no more guilt, no more struggle, just peace, just purity. Fight it, Margaret. I know you're still in there somewhere. Fight it." But she just shook her head slowly. "There's nothing to fight. I'm not lost, Thomas. I'm found. I'm home. And I want you to come home too." Crow placed a hand on her shoulder, a possessive gesture that made Thomas's blood boil. "Margaret has been exemplary. She's helped us identify others on Blackwood Street who are ready for judgment. Your neighbors, Thomas, your friends, they're all coming here, one by one. Soon, the entire street will be empty, and a new community will rise in its place. A pure community. A perfect community. You're building an army," Thomas realized. "Not an army, a congregation. The judged don't fight. They have no need for violence. They simply spread the truth, share the honey, and wait for others to see the wisdom of cleansing. And what happens to those who resist?" Crow's smile faded. "They become food for the hive. Their sins are too great to be cleansed. So instead, they're broken down, digested, transformed into honey that will sustain the pure. Nothing is wasted. Detective, even the wicked serve a purpose." He moved closer to Thomas's cell. "I'm giving you one last chance. Accept the judgment willingly, like your wife did. Let the bees take your sins, your anger, your pride, become hollow and clean, or refuse and become nothing but sweetness and nutrients for those better than yourself. I'll die before I let you turn me into one of your drones." "That can be arranged." Crow nodded to Margaret. "My dear, would you like to judge your husband? It seems appropriate, given all he's put you through." Margaret stepped forward, and when she raised her hands, Thomas saw that her fingers had split open at the tips. From each finger emerged a bee, crawling out of her flesh like she was some kind of human hive. "I forgive you, Thomas," she said softly, "for all the years of loneliness, for Sarah, for everything. And I want to free you from the burden of your sins. This won't hurt. The judgment is a mercy." She placed her hands against the transparent wall, and the bees began to work, secreting some kind of enzyme that dissolved the barrier. In seconds, there was a hole large enough for her to reach through. Thomas backed against the far wall of his cell, but there was nowhere to go. Margaret's hand, with its cargo of bees, reached toward his face. "No!" Dr. Rosenthal's voice rang out. "Thomas, now! Push through your walls!" "They're weak enough." With strength born of desperation, Thomas threw himself at the weakened honeycomb wall behind him. It gave way with a sickening crunch, and suddenly he was tumbling into another cell, this one empty, then through another weak wall, and another. Behind him, he heard Crow's angry shout and Margaret's confused humming. The entire hive seemed to erupt with activity. alarms that sounded like frantic buzzing echoing through the chambers. Thomas crashed through one more wall and found himself in a corridor. The honeycomb here was older, more established, harder to break. But he could see light ahead, real light, not the phosphorescent glow of the hive, but actual daylight filtering through some opening. He ran, his weakened legs barely holding him up, his lungs burning from the sweet, heavy air. Behind him, he could hear the swarm coming, thousands of bees pouring through the corridors in pursuit. The exit was a crack in the hive's exterior, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Thomas forced himself into it, feeling the honeycomb scrape against his skin, tearing the waxy coating from his body. For one terrible moment, he thought he was stuck, that he'd die here, trapped between inside and outside. Then something grabbed his hand, a human hand, warm and strong, and pulled him through. Thomas tumbled out onto the ground and looked up at his rescuer. It was a young woman, maybe 30, with wild black hair and eyes that held both compassion and determination. She wore a leather coat covered in strange symbols, and around her neck hung dozens of small jars, filled with various liquids. "Can you walk?" she asked, in a thick accent, Eastern European, Thomas thought. I think so." "Then walk, fast. We don't have much time before the swarm tracks you." She helped him to his feet, and Thomas finally got a look at where he was. They were still in the garden of the Victorian, but everything had changed. The house itself had been completely consumed by the hive, transformed into a massive organic structure that rose 40 feet into the air. The garden was gone, replaced by a landscape of honeycomb and resin, and everywhere bees crawled and flew in thick clouds. But beyond the fence, Thomas could see Blackwood Street, and it looked normal. Evening was falling, and lights were coming on in windows. People were walking their dogs. Children were playing. It was as if the horror happening in this garden was invisible to the rest of the world. "How is this possible?" Thomas breathed. "Glamour," the woman replied, leading him quickly toward the fence. "He makes them see what he wants them to see, makes them forget what they've witnessed. But the glamour doesn't work on everyone. There are those of us who can see the truth. My name is Elena Kovac. I'm a beekeeper too, detective. But not his kind. I came to stop him." They reached the fence, and Elena pulled out one of her jars. She opened it and splashed the contents across the fence, some kind of oil that smelled of smoke and herbs. Immediately, the bees that had been pursuing them veered away, as if the fence had become anathema to them. "That will hold them for a few minutes, but only a few. We need to get you somewhere safe, and then we need to talk. Because Silas Crow isn't just going to harvest Blackwood Street, detective. He's going to harvest all of Chicago. And if we don't stop him in the next 48 hours, there won't be anything left of this city but honey and husks." Thomas looked back at the monstrous hive that had consumed his neighbor's house, that held his wife and so many others prisoner. Somewhere in there, Dr. Rosenthal and Peter Chen and the others were still trapped, still resisting. "Then we'd better work fast," he said, "because I'm not letting him have this city, and I'm not letting him have my wife." Elena smiled grimly. "Good, because I'm going to need your help to kill a god." Elena took Thomas to a boarding house on the edge of Little Italy, far enough from Blackwood Street that the omnipresent humming finally faded to silence. The proprietor, a stout Italian woman named Rosa, seemed to expect them, ushering them inside without questions and pressing hot food and wine into their hands. "Rosa helps those who see," Elena explained, as Thomas devoured bread and cheese like a starving man. "There are more of us than you'd think, people who've noticed the strangeness, who've seen through the glamour. We've been forming a network, watching Crow, trying to understand what he is and how to stop him." "And what is he?" Thomas asked between bites. Elena sighed and pulled out an old leather-bound book from her coat. The cover was unmarked, but the pages inside were covered in a mix of languages some Thomas recognized, others that looked like nothing he'd ever seen. "Silas Crow is old, detective. Very old. Old enough that Silas Crow is probably not even his real name, just the latest identity in a long line of them. In my country, we have stories of such beings. We call them Pchelovodus bee speakers, men who made pacts with ancient spirits, who learned to command the hives and use them as weapons. Spirits? You're talking about magic? I'm talking about powers older than Christianity, older than civilization. The bees were sacred once, Detective. Did you know that? In ancient Egypt, in Greece, in the forests of Old Europe, bees were seen as messengers between worlds, as carriers of souls. And some men learned to harness that power. She flipped through the book, showing Thomas illustrations that made his skin crawl woodcuts, of men covered in bees, of hives built from human bones, of honey dripping from the mouths of the dead. The Pchelovodas were supposed to use their power to protect their communities, to bless harvests and cure illnesses, but some became corrupted. They began to see humanity not as something to protect, but as something to improve, to perfect. And they used their bees to judge people, to extract sins like poison from a wound. So Crow is one of these bee speakers? The last one, as far as I know. My grandmother was a beekeeper in the old way. She taught me the prayers, the rituals, the protections, and she told me that if I ever encountered a corrupted Pchelodova, I had to stop him, no matter the cost. Because once they start harvesting, they don't stop. They can't stop. The bees become addicted to human essence, to the taste of souls, and they'll consume entire cities to satisfy their hunger. Thomas thought of Margaret, of the hollow look in her eyes. Can the judged be saved? Can they be restored to what they were? Elena's expression softened. I don't know. In the old stories, once someone has been fully judged, what remains is more bee than human. The hive has consumed their essence, replaced their humanity with something else. But your wife, if she was judged recently, if her essence hasn't been fully extracted yet, there might be a chance. A small one. What do we need to do? We need to destroy the primary hive, the one in the Victorian. It's the heart of Crow's power, the nexus through which he controls all the other bees. But it won't be easy. The hive is defended not just by the swarm, but by the judged themselves. And Crow will be at his strongest there. You said you came here to stop him. That implies you have a pratic plan. Elena smiled. I have the beginning of a plan. The rest I was hoping to figure out with help. Fire won't work. The hive is too wet, too organic. It would just smoke and smolder. Poison won't work either. Crow has made himself immune to every known toxin. But there is one substance that bees cannot tolerate, one thing that disrupts their entire system. What? Smoke. Not just any smoke, but smoke from specific plants, burned in specific combinations. My grandmother called it the cleansing smoke. It breaks the connection between the Pchelodova and his swarm, severs the psychic link that allows him to control them. Without that link, the bees become just bees again. Dangerous, yes, but not supernatural, not coordinated. And without his bees? Without his bees, Crow is just a man, a very old, very sick man who should have died centuries ago. The bees have been keeping him alive, rebuilding his body with wax and honey. Take them away, and he'll collapse. Thomas leaned back, his mind racing. All right, so we make this cleansing smoke, we break his connection to the swarm, and then we kill him. But how do we get close enough to do it? That hive is a fortress. We go in from below, Elena said. Every hive needs drainage, needs a way to expel waste. Crow's hive is built on top of old Chicago, on top of the tunnels and sewers that run beneath the streets. If we can find the right entrance, we can come up inside the hive itself. And you know where this entrance is? Rosa's husband is a city engineer. He's been mapping the tunnels for weeks, looking for structural changes, anomalies. He thinks he's founded a shaft that runs directly beneath the Victorian, one that's been recently modified. Organic material growing into the infrastructure. Thomas nodded slowly. It was insane, suicidal even. But what choice did they have? When do we go? Tomorrow night. I need time to prepare the smoke, to gather the herbs and perform the rituals. And you need time to rest, to regain your strength. You're no good to me if you collapse halfway through. Rosa showed Thomas to a small room on the third floor. It was clean and simple, with a single bed, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the city. In the distance, Thomas could see the smoke from the industrial district, the lights from downtown, the ordinary life of Chicago continuing as if nothing was wrong. How many people out there had already consumed crow's honey? How many were walking around with that golden tint to their eyes, humming unconsciously, slowly transforming into drones? And how many would be judged before this was over? He thought of Margaret, of her hand reaching toward him, of the love in her voice even as bees crawled from her fingers. Somewhere in that hive, his wife was still alive. Still fighting, he hoped. Still herself, at least in some small way. "I'm coming for you," he whispered to the night. "I promise, I'm coming for you." That night, Thomas dreamed of honey. He dreamed of drowning in it, of its sweetness filling his lungs, of his body being preserved in amber while bees wrote his sins across his skin in careful calligraphy. He dreamed of Margaret standing over him, smiling that empty smile, saying, "It doesn't hurt. The judgment is a mercy." He woke before dawn, gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat. But it wasn't just sweat. His skin was leaking, a thin, amber-colored fluid that smelled faintly of honey. Elena had warned him this might happen. The brief time he'd spent in the hive, the small amount of honey he'd consumed, it had started the transformation. Not far enough to be irreversible, but far enough that he could feel it working in him, changing him from the inside out. He had perhaps 3 days before the change became permanent. 3 days to stop Crow, to destroy the hive, to save Margaret and the others. 3 days to save himself. Elena found him at the wash basin, scrubbing the amber fluid from his skin with harsh soap. She said nothing, just handed him one of her jars, this one filled with a thick green paste. "Rub this on your skin. It will slow the process, buy you more time." "But Thomas?" She met his eyes. "If we don't succeed tomorrow night, if we can't destroy the hive, you need to promise me something." "What?" "Don't let yourself be judged. End it yourself, quickly, before Crow can claim you. Because what he does to those who resist the way he harvests them, uses them, it's worse than death. It's eternal. Your consciousness trapped in honeycomb, aware but unable to move or speak or die. Forever." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. They spent the day in preparation. Elena gathered her supplies, grinding herbs, mixing oils, chanting prayers in a language that made the air smell of old forests and older magic. Thomas cleaned his service revolver, sharpened a knife Rosa gave him, and tried not to think about the fact that he was about to descend into a nightmare. Rosa's husband, Antonio, brought them maps of the sewers, sketches he'd made of the anomalies he'd discovered. "It's not natural what's happening down there," he said, his accent thick with fear. "The walls are changing, becoming soft, organic, and there are sounds humming, like you described. It's spreading, Detective. Whatever Crow is doing, it's not contained to just his house anymore. It's growing into the city's infrastructure." "How long before it becomes unstoppable?" Thomas asked. Antonio shook his head. "Days, maybe less. The growth rate is exponential. If he's not stopped soon, the entire city's water system, electric grid, everything, it'll all be compromised." As evening fell, Elena completed her preparations. She had 3 small braziers, each filled with dried plants and resins, each inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift when Thomas wasn't looking directly at them. She also had a larger container, a clay jar sealed with wax that she handled with extreme care. "What's in there?" Thomas asked. "The queen's death," Elena replied. "Every hive has a queen. Kill her and the hive dies. But Crow's queen isn't a bee. It's part of him, grown from his own flesh. This mixture will destroy her, but I have to get close, within arm's reach, and it has to touch his skin directly. That means getting through the entire hive and reaching Crow himself." "Yes, Elena, that's a suicide mission." She smiled sadly. "My grandmother always said I'd die fighting a monster. I suppose she was right. But if I can take Crow with me, if I can free all those souls he's trapped, then it's a good death. Thomas wanted to argue, to tell her there had to be another way. But he'd been a detective long enough to know when someone had made peace with their fate. They left as soon as it was fully dark, slipping through the streets of Chicago like shadows. Antonio led them to a maintenance entrance 3 blocks from Blackwood Street, a rusted door set into the side of a building that most people passed without noticing. This tunnel runs straight to the Victorian, he explained, unlocking the door with a key he probably shouldn't have had. But be careful. I haven't been down there in 2 weeks. God knows what's changed since then. The tunnel was exactly as awful as Thomas had expected. Narrow, dark, dripping with moisture that definitely wasn't just water. The smell hit them immediately. That overwhelming sweetness mixed with decay, evidence that Crow's influence had indeed spread into the city's foundations. They'd gone perhaps 50 yards when Thomas's flashlight revealed what Antonio had warned them about. The tunnel walls were covered in honeycomb, layers of it spreading across the brick and concrete like a fungal infection. And within the cells, Thomas could see things moving, not bees, but something else. Larvae, perhaps, or worse. "Don't touch the walls," Elena warned. Though Thomas had no intention of doing so, they pressed on, and the tunnel began to change more dramatically. The honeycomb grew thicker, the ceiling lower, until they were hunched over, wading through shallow pools of honey that made every step sticky and slow. The humming that had been faint at first grew louder, until it seemed to come from all around them, from within them. Then Thomas saw the first body. It was suspended in the wall, encased in amber, perfectly preserved. A man, middle-aged, wearing the remains of a business suit. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and his chest cavity was empty, not torn open, but hollowed out, every internal organ replaced with honeycomb. "One of the resistant ones," Elena whispered. "The ones who wouldn't accept the judgment willingly. This is what Crow does to them." There were more, dozens, then hundreds, all suspended in the walls, all harvested, all reduced to empty husks filled with sweetness. Thomas recognized some of them, missing persons he'd investigated, people who'd vanished from Chicago's streets over the past year. They'd all ended up here, in Crow's larder, their essences extracted and stored while their bodies served as breeding grounds for his ever-expanding hive. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they reached their destination. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the basement of the Victorian, Thomas realized, though it was now barely recognizable as such. The entire space had been transformed into a cathedral of honeycomb, with massive pillars rising to support the structure above and pools of honey reflecting the phosphorescent light that seemed to emanate from every surface. And in the center of it all, arranged in careful patterns, were the cells containing the prisoners. Thomas could see Dr. Rosenthal, still alive, still fighting, pressing against the weakened walls of his cell. Peter Chen was there too, looking gaunt but conscious. And others, dozens of others, in various stages of judgment, but there was no sign of Margaret or Crow. "They'll be higher," Elena said, lighting her 3 braziers. "At the top of the hive. That's where the queen chamber always is. But we have to start here, with the smoke. It needs time to spread through the entire structure." She began to chant in that strange language, and immediately the smoke from the braziers changed. Instead of rising normally, it seemed to move with purpose, spreading horizontally through the chamber, seeping into the honeycomb walls like water into a sponge. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The humming, which had been constant, suddenly became discordant, confused. Bees began dropping from the ceiling, their flight erratic, their coordination gone. The walls themselves seemed to shudder, and Thomas heard screaming not from the prisoners, but from the hive itself, as if the structure was somehow alive and in pain. "It's working," Elena said, her eyes bright with fierce joy. "The connection is breaking. Now we go up, before Crow realizes what's happening and mounts a defense." They ran through the cathedral chamber, past the cells, toward a spiral ramp that led upward into the heart of the hive. Behind them, Thomas could hear the cells beginning to crack open as the weakened honeycomb finally gave way. The prisoners were escaping, stumbling out into the chamber, disoriented, but free. "Go!" Thomas shouted to them. "Get out through the tunnels! Run!" Dr. Rosenthal stumbled toward him, his face gaunt and pale. "Thomas, Margaret is above, in the Queen Chamber." "But she's not alone. There are dozens of the judged up there, guarding Crow. And Thomas. She's the primary vessel now. He's using her body to breed a new generation." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, but there was no time to process them. Elena was already ascending the ramp, her clay jar held carefully before her, and Thomas had to follow or lose her in the labyrinthine structure. The ramp spiraled upward through chambers that grew increasingly nightmarish. The walls here weren't just honeycomb, they were organic in a more fundamental way, pulsing like living tissue, veined with what looked disturbingly like blood vessels carrying honey instead of blood. And everywhere, embedded in the walls, were faces. Not just bodies, but faces pressed against translucent membranes, mouths open, eyes staring, all humming in broken harmony as the cleansing smoke disrupted Crow's control. They emerged into a vast chamber that must have once been the Victorians' entire third floor. But now it was a throne room, a temple, a horror beyond description. The ceiling rose 50 feet above them, all of it covered in dripping honeycomb that caught the light and threw it back in golden fractals. And suspended from that ceiling by thick cords of wax and resin were cocoons, hundreds of them, each containing a human form in various stages of transformation. At the far end of the chamber, on a throne constructed from the bodies of his victims, sat Silas Crow. He looked different now. The human pretense was gone. His body had merged fully with the hive, his torso opened like a flower to reveal chambers full of larvae and pupae. His arms ended in masses of bees that formed and reformed into different shapes, hands, claws, tools. His face was the only thing that remained somewhat human, though his eyes were now completely compound, reflecting the world in 1,000 tiny facets. And kneeling before him, arranged in worshipful positions, were the judged, Thomas's neighbors, his friends, people he'd known for years, all of them humming, all of them swaying in unison, all of them golden-eyed and empty. And in the center, closest to Crow, was Margaret. She was no longer wearing the white robe. Instead, her body was wrapped in what looked like a wedding dress made entirely of beeswax and spider silk, translucent enough that Thomas could see the bees moving beneath her. Skin could see the honeycomb growing in her chest cavity, where her heart should be. "Margaret," Thomas whispered, her head turned toward him with mechanical precision. For a moment, there was no recognition in those golden eyes. But then something flickered, some spark of the woman she'd been, and her mouth formed his name, though no sound came out. "Detective Halloway." Crow's voice boomed through the chamber, coming from everywhere at once. "You've ruined my cathedral with your smoke, broken my beautiful connection with my children." "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I've freed them," Thomas replied, raising his revolver. "And I'm going to free the rest, starting with my wife." Crow laughed, and the sound was like 1,000 bees screaming. "Free them? You can't free what doesn't want to be freed. Margaret is happy, Detective. She's found purpose, meaning, peace. Haven't you, my dear?" Margaret's mouth opened, and bees crawled out, arranging themselves in the air to form words. Happy, purpose, peace. But Thomas saw the tears on her face, saw how her hands trembled, saw the horror in her eyes fighting against the serenity of her expression. She was still in there, still fighting, trapped in her own body as Crow used it for his purposes. "Elena, now!" Thomas shouted. Elena rushed forward, the clay jar raised above her head, chanting in that ancient language. The smoke from the braziers below had filled the chamber now, and Crow's control was clearly weakening. The judged were swaying erratically, their humming discordant, some of them collapsing entirely. But Crow wasn't finished yet. With a gesture, he sent a wave of bees toward Elena. Not thousands, but millions. A living tsunami of insects that engulfed her in seconds. She screamed but didn't drop the jar. Even as the bees stung her, even as they tried to crawl into her mouth and nose, she kept moving forward, kept chanting, kept fighting. Thomas fired his revolver. The shots echoing through the chamber. The bullets struck Crow's throne, his body, but they had no effect. He simply absorbed them, the honey in his veins sealing the wounds instantly. "You can't kill me with human weapons," Crow said, rising from his throne. "I'm beyond human now, beyond death. I am the swarm, and the swarm is eternal." Elena was 10 feet from Crow now, 5 feet, almost within reach. The jar was raised, ready to throw, and Thomas could see triumph in her eyes, even as the bees ravaged her flesh. But then Margaret moved. She stepped between Elena and Crow, her movements jerky and reluctant, as if fighting against herself. Her hand shot out and grabbed Elena's wrist, and from her fingers emerged bees, dozens of them, stinging, injecting venom directly into Elena's bloodstream. Elena's eyes met Thomas's across the chamber. "The jar!" she screamed. "Take it!" With the last of her strength, she threw the clay container toward Thomas. It spun through the air in slow motion, and Thomas dove to catch it, his fingers closing around the warm clay just as Elena collapsed, her body already beginning to swell from the massive dose of venom. "No!" Thomas roared, but Elena smiled, even as she died. "Finish it," she whispered, "for all of us." Thomas looked at the jar in his hands, then at Crow, then at Margaret, standing between them. He had one chance, one throw, but to reach Crow, he'd have to go through his wife. "Margaret," he called out, "if you can hear me, if any part of you is still in there, please, move. Let me end this." For a long moment, she stood frozen. Then, slowly, her head shook. Not a refusal, but a tremor, as if something inside her was fighting for control. "Thomas!" Her voice came out strangled, barely human. "I can't. He's too strong." But her hand moved, just slightly, and Thomas saw what she was trying to tell him. The dress she wore, the wax and silk, it was flammable, and in her other hand, hidden from Crow's view, she held one of Elena's fallen braziers, still smoking with the cleansing smoke. She wanted him to burn her, to burn through her, to reach Crow. "I can't," Thomas whispered. "Margaret, I can't do that to you." "Do it," she managed to say, her voice her own for just a moment. "Save them. Save Chicago. I love you." Then Crow's control snapped back, and Margaret lunged toward Thomas, bees pouring from her mouth and hands. But Thomas had already made his decision. He threw the brazier at Margaret's feet, and the flames caught immediately, racing up her wax dress with horrifying speed. Margaret screamed a sound of such agony that Thomas would hear it in his nightmares for the rest of his life, but she didn't move away. Instead, she ran toward Crow, her body a living torch, trailing fire and smoke. "No!" Crow shouted, backing away from his throne. "What have you done?" Margaret crashed into him, and the flame spread to his wax and honey body immediately. The effect was catastrophic. Crow had built himself out of the most flammable materials imaginable, and now he was burning, his carefully constructed form melting and charring. But Thomas had one more thing to do. While Crow was distracted by the flames, he opened Elena's jar and hurled the contents directly at the burning mass that had been Silas Crow. The liquid inside the Queen's death struck Crow's exposed core, and the effect was instantaneous. His screams reached a pitch that shattered the honeycomb walls, caused the entire structure to shudder. The bees that made up his body scattered in panic, their coordination completely destroyed. And Thomas saw, just for a moment, what Silas Crow really was beneath all the honey and wax and insects. He was old, ancient, a withered thing that should have died centuries ago, kept alive only by his unholy communion with the swarm. His real body was barely more than a skeleton wrapped in papery skin, his eyes sunken deep in their sockets, his mouth a black hole of decay. "No," Crow whispered, his voice suddenly small and human. "No, I was so close to perfection, to purity, to—" His words cut off as the flames consumed him entirely. The body collapsed, crumbling to ash and bone, and with it, the entire hive began to die. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. All around the chamber, the judge collapsed. The supernatural force that had been animating them suddenly gone. The honeycomb walls began to crack and crumble, honey pouring from the breaks like blood from mortal wounds. The cocoons suspended from the ceiling tore open, releasing their occupants most dead, but some, miraculously, still alive. Thomas ran to where Margaret had fallen. Her body was badly burned, her waxed dress melted away, but she was breathing, barely. "Margaret." He cradled her head in his lap. "Hold on. Please. Hold on." Her eyes opened, and they were blue again. Her own blue, not the golden tint of the judged. "Thomas," she whispered, "I could see everything. All the people he consumed, all their memories. So much pain. Don't talk. Save your strength. No time." She smiled weakly. "The bees are leaving me, taking back what they put in. But there's nothing left. They hollowed me out. The doctors can help. We'll get you to a hospital." "Thomas," her hand found his. "I'm so cold, so empty. There's nothing inside anymore. But at least I'm free. We're all free." Her eyes closed. "Margaret? Margaret!" But she was gone, her body growing still in his arms. Around him, the hive was collapsing, honey and wax and broken cocoons raining down from above. Thomas held his wife's body and screamed his grief into the dying structure. Dr. Rosenthal found him there minutes later, still holding Margaret, tears streaming down his face. "Thomas," the doctor said gently, "we have to go. The whole structure is coming down. She's gone." "One," Thomas said numbly. "She saved us all, and she's gone." "I know. I'm so sorry. But if we don't leave now, her sacrifice will be for nothing." Slowly, reluctantly, Thomas laid Margaret's body down gently on the crumbling floor. He removed his coat and covered her with it, a final gesture of dignity. Then he let Dr. Rosenthal lead him through the collapsing hive, past the freed prisoners who were stumbling toward the exits, out into the basement chamber where Elena's body still lay, surrounded by dead bees. They emerged from the tunnel into a Chicago dawn, filthy and traumatized, but alive. Behind them, the Victorian groaned and collapsed, imploding as the hive structure that had supported it dissolved. Dust and debris filled the air, and the sound of the collapse brought neighbors running from their homes. But Thomas noticed something strange. As the judge emerged from the wreckage, those who had survived, they looked confused, disoriented, but not monstrous. The golden tint was fading from their eyes. The hexagonal patterns on their skin were disappearing. With Crow dead and the hive destroyed, the transformation was reversing. Not everyone would recover. Some had been too far gone, too completely hollowed out. But many, most, even, would eventually return to themselves, though they would carry the memories of their time as part of the hive forever. Over the following days, Chicago slowly returned to normal. The authorities investigated the collapse of the Victorian, attributing it to structural failure and gas leak. The hundreds of bodies found in the wreckage were explained as the victims of a deranged serial killer who had been keeping his victims in the building. Silas Crow was officially declared dead, his remains identified through dental records that turned out to be fraudulent. The truth was suppressed, as truth often is when it's too terrible to accept. The few who spoke of bees and honey and supernatural judgments were dismissed as traumatized, their memories unreliable. But Thomas knew the truth, and so did the others who had been there, who had been judged and freed. They formed a quiet network, watching for any signs that Crow's evil might resurface, that another bee speaker might emerge. Thomas buried Margaret on a gray November morning, in a cemetery overlooking Lake Michigan. Dr. Rosenthal attended, and Peter Chen, and Rosa, and Antonio. They didn't speak of what had happened in the hive. They didn't need to. They all carried the memories, the scars, the knowledge that they had looked into the abyss and survived. At the funeral, Thomas noticed bees landing on Margaret's coffin. Not many, just a few, moving slowly in the cold air. But they didn't sting or threaten. They simply crawled across the polished wood, as if paying their respects, and then flew away. "They know, Doctor," Rosenthal said quietly. "The bees. They know what she did, what she sacrificed." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. That night, alone in his empty house, Thomas opened a drawer in his study and removed a jar. It was one of Elena's, one she'd given him before they entered the hive. Inside was a thick salve she'd called the Memory Keeper, something to help him remember the truth when the world tried to make him forget. He didn't need it. He would never forget. Not Margaret's sacrifice, not Elena's bravery, not the faces of those trapped in Crow's honeycomb walls, not the lesson that evil comes in many forms, some of them sweet as honey. Outside his window, Chicago hummed with ordinary life. People went to work, children played, the city breathed and moved and lived, oblivious to how close it had come to becoming a hive, a hollow thing filled with sweetness and horror. But Thomas knew, and he would keep watch. Because Elena had been right about one thing Silas Crow had claimed to be the last of his kind, but evil like that doesn't simply end. It transforms, adapts, finds new vessels. The bees were still out there, and they were always hungry. The autumn of 1915 brought with it an unseasonable warmth to Chicago, and with that warmth, Thomas Halloway felt the old fear returning. He stood at his bedroom window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and gold colors that still made his stomach turn even 5 years after the events on Blackwood Street. The house felt wrong today. Too quiet, too still. He'd noticed it when he woke an absence of the usual morning sounds. No birds singing in the trees outside, no insects buzzing in the garden, just silence, heavy and expectant, like the world was holding its breath. Thomas was 52 now, gray-haired and weathered, with lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and memories that wouldn't fade. He'd retired from the police force 3 years ago, unable to continue pretending that the cases he investigated were the real threats to Chicago's safety. The city had bigger problems, darker secrets, than most people could imagine. He'd spent those 3 years investigating quietly, following rumors and whispers, tracking down anyone who might have information about bee speakers, about ancient magic, about the things that lurked in the spaces between the rational and the impossible. He'd become an expert on Silas Crow's history, tracing the man's movements back through decades, through centuries even, finding patterns of destruction and harvest that stretched across continents. And everywhere Crow had been, the same pattern emerged. A period of integration, of gaining trust, of distributing honey. Then the judgment, the harvesting, the transformation of entire communities into hives. And always, before the end, Crow would move on, leaving behind only ruins and rumors, and the occasional survivor who would speak of bees and sweetness and horror. But something else had emerged from Thomas's research, something that chilled him more than anything else. Crow always left seeds behind, small hidden hives, dormant queens, caches of his special honey sealed in forgotten places, insurance, perhaps against his own death. Or maybe just the compulsion of a creature that could never truly die, only transform and return. Thomas had found 3 such caches in the past 5 years, one in the basement of an abandoned church on the south side, another in a forgotten storage room at the stockyards, a third in the walls of a boarding house that had burned down mysteriously in 1908. Each time, he destroyed them with fire and Elena's cleansing smoke, watching the honey bubble and burn, watching the dormant bees shrivel and die. But he knew there were more. There had to be. And lately, he'd been hearing rumors again. Reports of people acting strangely, of honey being sold at markets that made those who consumed it docile, suggestible, of a humming sound that echoed through the industrial district at night. The swarm was waking up. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas descended the stairs slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, and found Dr. Abraham Rosenthal on his doorstep, looking even more worn than Thomas felt. "Abraham, this is early, even for you." "We need to talk, Doctor." Rosenthal said without preamble. It started again. They sat in Thomas's study, the room where he'd compiled 5 years of research into the Pichelevotus and their methods. Maps covered the walls, connected by red string, newspaper clippings pinned alongside ancient texts, photographs of victims, of hives, of places where Crow had been. "Tell me," Thomas said. "Doctor?" Rosenthal pulled out a medical journal from his bag. This was published last week by Dr. Harold Chen Peters' older brother. Remember him? He's been working at Cook County Hospital. According to this article, he's documented 17 cases in the past month of what he calls spontaneous amber crystallization. Explain. Patients coming in with complaints of lethargy, unusual hunger, for sweets, and strange markings on their skin. When Harold examines them, he finds their blood has an abnormally high sugar content. And in advanced cases, their blood actually begins to crystallize, turning into something resembling honey. He's baffled, has no explanation for it. Thomas felt his hands go cold. "It's the honey. Crow's honey. Someone's distributing it again." That was my thought. But Thomas, there's more. Dr. Rosenthal leaned forward. 3 days ago, one of Harold's patients, a woman named Catherine Moore, entered a catatonic state. No response to stimuli, barely breathing. Heart rate so slow it was almost undetectable. But here's the strange part. She was humming. Even in the coma, she was humming that tune. Harold had her isolated, but the next morning, she was gone. Just vanished from a locked room on the 4th floor. And you think, I think she was called, summoned, by whatever is taking Crow's place. Dr. Rosenthal's hands shook as he pulled out another document. I've been making inquiries, discreetly. There are others. At least 30 people in Chicago who have disappeared over the past 6 weeks. All of them reported eating honey from an unknown source before their disappearance. And Thomas? Most of them were people who lived on Blackwood Street 5 years ago. People who were judged and freed when we destroyed the hive. Thomas stood and walked to his wall of research. His finger traced a map of Chicago, stopping on several marked locations. I found something last week. In the city archives, there's a record of property purchases made in the name of Ezekiel Crane in 1908, 2 years before Crow moved to Blackwood Street. All of them buildings with large basements or access to the old tunnel system. You think Crow was planning this from the beginning? Creating backup locations? I think Silas Crow was older and more cunning than we gave him credit for. And I think when we killed him, or thought we killed him, we only destroyed one node of a much larger network. The seeds he planted are germinating, Abraham. And something is calling the old victims back. Then we need to find where they're being taken. Stop it before it spreads. Thomas turned to face his old friend. I've been tracking the disappearances, mapping them. And there's a pattern. They're all moving toward a central location, the old Stockyards district. Specifically, a meat processing plant that closed down in 1912 called Thornton & Sons. The Stockyards? Why there? Think about it. A massive facility designed to process living things. Cold storage for preservation. Underground tunnels for moving product. And completely abandoned, no oversight, no neighbors to notice strange activity. It's perfect for someone trying to rebuild what Crow started. Dr. Rosenthal stood as well, his face grim. Then we go there. Tonight. And we end this before it can begin. No. Thomas shook his head. We need help. 5 years. We barely survived, and that was with Elena's knowledge and preparation. We can't just walk into whatever is waiting at that plant, unprepared. Then who do we call? The police? They won't believe us. The church? They'll think we're mad. Thomas walked to his desk and pulled out a letter from a locked drawer. Do you remember Elena mentioning that she was part of a network? Beekeepers who fought the corrupted Pichelevotus? Yes, but I thought they were all in Europe. Most of them are. But I've been corresponding with a woman in New York, Yekaterina Volkov. She's Elena's niece, trained in the same traditions. I wrote to her 3 weeks ago, when the rumors started. She should be arriving in Chicago. He checked his pocket watch. In about 4 hours. Yekaterina Volkov was not what Thomas had expected. Where Elena had been middle-aged and weathered, Yekaterina was young, perhaps 25, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see through people. She wore modern American clothing, but around her neck hung dozens of small jars and pouches, just as Elena had. They met at Union Station, and Yekaterina wasted no time on pleasantries. "You should have written sooner," she said, her accent thicker than Elena's had been. 3 weeks is barely enough time to prepare properly. My aunt died fighting Silas Crow, yes? And you think he has returned? Not exactly, Thomas explained as they walked to his automobile. But something is happening. People are being called, transformed, taken to a location we believe is connected to Crow's network. Taken, or going willingly. Yekaterina's question was sharp. Thomas paused. He hadn't considered that distinction. I'm not sure. It matters. If they go willingly, if they seek out the transformation, then they are not victims, they are believers. And believers are much more dangerous than victims. They drove to Thomas's house, where Peter Chen was already waiting. The young chemist had become one of Thomas's closest allies in tracking Crow's legacy. He'd recovered from his time in the hive, but like all the survivors, he carried the psychological scars. "Mr. Halloway?" Peter greeted him, then turned to Yekaterina. "You're Elena's niece. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your aunt saved all of us." Yekaterina nodded curtly. "She died well. Now we must ensure her death meant something. Tell me everything you know about Thornton and Sons." They gathered in Thomas's study, and Peter spread out blueprints of the meat processing plant he'd obtained from city records. The facility covers 4 acres. The main building is 3 stories, all above ground, but beneath it is an extensive basement and cold storage system that connects to the old tunnel network. If someone wanted to rebuild Crow's operation, this would be ideal. "How many entrances?" Yekaterina asked, studying the blueprints with a professional eye. 4 main ones, all above ground. But there are also ventilation shafts, delivery tunnels, and at least 2 emergency exits from the basement that led out near the Chicago River. "And you've done reconnaissance?" Thomas shook his head. "We wanted to wait for you. If there's something supernatural in there, we need to be prepared." Yekaterina pulled out a leather-bound journal, Elena's journal, Thomas realized, with a pang of recognition. My aunt wrote extensively about Silas Crow after she began tracking him. She believed he was not simply a man who had learned to control bees, but something older, a being that had merged with the concept of the hive itself, becoming less human and more archetypal. "I don't understand," Dr. Rosenthal said. "The ancient beekeepers believed that bees were manifestations of a collective consciousness, a single intelligence spread across thousands of bodies. Crow found a way to join that consciousness, to become part of it. When you killed his physical body, you destroyed one node. But the consciousness itself, the hive mind, it survived in the bees he'd created, in the honey he'd distributed, in the people he'd transformed." Thomas felt sick. "You're saying Crow is still alive?" "Not alive in the way you mean. But his consciousness, his will, his hunger, yes, those survive. And they're trying to rebuild, to reconstitute, to create a new physical vessel through which to manifest. Using the survivors as raw material," Peter realized. "That's why they're being called back. He needs people who've already been partially transformed, whose bodies remember the hive." Yekaterina nodded. "Exactly. And if he succeeds, if he manages to rebuild himself, he'll be stronger than before, because this time, he'll know his enemies, he'll know their methods. He'll be ready for people like us." "Then we have to stop him before the reconstitution is complete," Thomas said. "How do we do that?" Yekaterina opened her coat, revealing an arsenal of jars, bottles, and small leather pouches. "We destroy the queen chamber. Again. But this time, we make sure nothing survives. No seeds, no backup hives, no escape routes. We burn it all to ash and salt the earth where it stood." "You make it sound simple," Dr. Rosenthal said dryly. "It's not simple. It's likely suicide." "But it's necessary." Yekaterina met each of their eyes in turn. "I won't lie to you. My aunt went into that hive knowing she would die. I go into Thornton and Sons with the same knowledge. But I will not let Crow's evil spread again. Not while I live. They spent the rest of the day in preparation. Yekaterina produced materials from her luggage that Thomas couldn't begin to identify, dried herbs that smelled of ancient forests, oils that shimmered with impossible colors, powders that made his eyes water when he got too close. "These are the tools of the old beekeepers," she explained, mixing components in careful proportions, passed down through generations. Elena would have used similar buddy preparations 5 years ago, but she didn't have time to do it properly. We have time. Not much, but enough. By evening, they had assembled an array of weapons, more of Elena's cleansing smoke in portable braziers, jars of the Queen's death compound, bottles of oil that Yekaterina claimed would burn even in the presence of honey's moisture, and small bells that rang with a frequency that disrupted bee communication. "One more thing," Yekaterina said, pulling out 4 small medallions on leather cords. "Wear these. They're blessed with prayers older than Christianity, older than most religions. They won't make you immune to the bees, but they'll make it harder for Crow's consciousness to influence you directly, to get inside your mind." Thomas took his medallion and felt it warm against his palm. It was carved from some kind of bone, etched with symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. "What are these symbols?" he asked. "The language of bees," Yekaterina replied. "Or at least, the human approximation of it. They basically say, I am not food. I am not a vessel. I am closed to you." Whether Crow's consciousness will respect that, we'll find out. They set out for the stockyards as the sun began to set, driving through Chicago's streets in Thomas's automobile. The city seemed oblivious to the threat growing in its abandoned industrial district, people going about their evening routines, couples strolling in the parks, children playing in the last light of day. "They have no idea how close they came to being consumed," Peter said quietly, watching the city pass by. 5 years ago, if we'd failed, if Elena hadn't sacrificed herself, all of them would be drones now. Hollow things filled with honey and hate. They still might be, Thomas replied grimly, if we fail tonight. The Stockyards district had been in decline even before the war. Many of the processing plants had closed, unable to compete with more modern facilities. The smell of death still hung in the air, a permanent stain left by decades of slaughter. But now it was mixed with something else, something sweeter, more cloying, honey. Thomas could smell it even before they came within sight of Thornton and Sons. It hung in the air like a fog, making his head swim, making him think of Margaret, of her smile as the bees crawled from her fingers, of her sacrifice. "The glamour is strong here," Yekaterina warned, holding up one of her jars. The liquid inside glowed faintly in the gathering darkness. "Crow is protecting this place, making people want to ignore it, forget about it. We must be careful not to succumb." They parked the automobile 2 blocks away and approached on foot. Thornton and Sons was a massive brick structure, 4 stories tall despite Peter's blueprints claiming only 3, with smokestacks that reached toward the evening sky like accusing fingers. Windows that should have been dark and empty instead glowed with a pale, phosphorescent light. And around the building, in the air and on the ground and crawling up the walls, were bees. Thousands of them, maybe millions, forming a living barrier around the structure. "They're guarding it, Doctor," Rosenthal breathed. "My God, they're actually standing guard." "Not standing," Yekaterina corrected. "Waiting. They know we're coming." Crow's consciousness has been rebuilding for 5 years. It remembers us, or remembers people like us. The attack is expected. "Then how do we get in?" Peter asked. Yekaterina smiled, and there was something of Elena in that smile, fierce and a little mad. "We don't sneak in. We announce ourselves. We challenge. We make Crow face us directly, draw him out, force him to defend his unfinished resurrection, and while he's distracted, we destroy the Queen Chamber." She pulled out one of her bells and rang it. The sound was unlike anything Thomas had heard, too high for normal hearing, almost painful, resonating in his bones and teeth. The bees reacted immediately, their coordinated movements breaking down into chaos, swarms breaking apart and reforming in agitated patterns. "That's the language of challenge," Yekaterina explained, ringing the bell again. "I've just told Crow that we're here to kill him. Again. And that we're not afraid." A moment of silence. Then, from within the building, came an answering hum. But this wasn't the droning sound Thomas remembered. This was deeper, more complex, carrying with it harmonics that formed words in his mind. "Come, then. Let us finish what was started. Let us see who will prevail, the swarm, or the humans who dare to defy nature's perfection." The bees parted, creating a path to the main entrance. An invitation. A trap. "Well, Doctor," Rosenthal said shakily, "at least we know he's home." They walked through the corridor of bees, Thomas's hand on his revolver, though he knew it would do little good. The bees didn't attack, just watched, with their 1,000 to 1,000 eyes, their wings creating that eternal hum that seemed to say, "Welcome, welcome, welcome home." The main door stood open, and beyond it, Thomas could see what Thornton and Sons had become. The entire interior had been transformed into a hive, not the organic, chaotic hive of the Victorian, but something more deliberate, more architectural. The walls were perfect honeycomb, arranged in mathematical precision. The floors were made of compressed pollen and wax. The ceiling was draped with cocoons arranged in mandala patterns that made Thomas's eyes hurt to look at. And suspended in the center of it all, in a chamber of amber 3 stories tall, was the thing that had been Silas Crow. It was no longer even remotely human. The form was vaguely humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head but constructed entirely from bees. Millions of them, holding themselves in the shape of a man, constantly moving, constantly shifting, forming temporary features, a face, hands, eyes, before dissolving back into the swarm. And within that mass, Thomas could see something solid, a core, a heart, made from what looked like human remains, fused with honeycomb. "The reconstitution is almost complete," Yekaterina breathed. "We're almost too late." "Almost," the swarm crow spoke, its voice coming from everywhere. "But not quite. You've arrived just in time to witness my rebirth, to see what I've become." Around the central chamber, Thomas could now see the survivors, the 30 or so people who had disappeared over the past weeks. They hung in smaller amber chambers, some conscious and screaming silently, others already transforming, their bodies being broken down and rebuilt as part of the hive infrastructure. And there, in a chamber of honor closest to Crow, Thomas saw a face he recognized, Mrs. Patterson. She was awake, aware, and when her eyes met his, they held no recognition, only that golden serenity of the fully judged. "You're using them," Thomas said, his voice tight with rage. "Using people who survived you once, people who should have been free." "Free?" The swarm laughed, and the sound was like wind through 1,000 hollow reeds. "They were never free, detective. Once you've been part of the hive, once you've tasted perfect unity, perfect purpose, freedom is just another word for loneliness. They came willingly. They wanted to come home." "Lies, Doctor." Rosenthal spat. "You called them, compelled them. I offered. They accepted. Is that so different from what your churches do? Your governments? Your families? Everyone seeks to belong to something larger than themselves. I simply offer the most perfect belonging of all." Yekaterina began moving around the chamber's perimeter, placing her braziers at specific points, marking symbols on the floor with powder that glowed faintly in the dim light. Crow's form tracked her movement but didn't interfere. "Elena's niece," the swarm observed. "You have her knowledge, her skill. But do you have her courage? She died screaming, you know. The venom liquefied her organs. She drowned in her own dissolved flesh. Is that the death you seek?" "My aunt died a hero," Yekaterina replied calmly, continuing her preparations. "She saved hundreds of lives. What have you done, Crow? Built monuments to your own ego? Enslaved innocent people? You're not a god. You're a parasite." The chamber suddenly filled with angry buzzing, the swarm form of Crow rippling with rage. "Parasite? I am evolution, girl. I am the next step. Humanity in its current form is a failed experiment, violent, selfish, destructive. I offer unity, peace, perfection. You offer death, Thomas said. Nothing more. Perhaps. But what is death but transformation? These people I've gathered, they're not dying. They're becoming, joining something eternal. When this city falls to my harvest, when every person in Chicago has been absorbed into the swarm, there will be no more crime, no more poverty, no more suffering. Isn't that what you wanted, Detective? Isn't that why you became a policeman, to end suffering? Thomas felt the words burrowing into his mind, trying to find purchase, trying to make him doubt. But the medallion around his neck grew warm, pushing back against the intrusion. Not like this, he said firmly. Never like this. Then you choose to be an obstacle. Very well. The swarm crow gestured, and the amber chambers around the room began to crack open. The survivors stumbled out, but they weren't themselves anymore. They were judged, transformed, golden-eyed, and humming, and they turned toward Thomas and his companions with empty, purposeful expressions. "Stop them!" Yekaterina shouted, lighting her braziers. Immediately, the cleansing smoke began to fill the chamber, and the effect was immediate. The judged hesitated, their movements becoming jerky and uncontrolled as the smoke disrupted Crow's influence. The swarm form itself rippled and distorted, bees, dropping from the formation like rain. "The smoke again!" Crow's voice was strained now, losing its omnipresent quality. "The old ways. But I've learned since last time, girl. I've adapted." The bees that formed Crow's body suddenly dispersed, spreading throughout the chamber, and from their dispersal emerged something Thomas hadn't seen before, a physical core. Not quite human, but human-shaped. Crow's actual body, or what remained of it after 5 years of dissolution and reformation. It was a horror, a skeleton wrapped in waxy skin, held together by honeycomb and amber, with bees living inside the chest cavity where organs should be. But the face was recognizably Crow's, preserved somehow, those amber eyes, still glowing with terrible intelligence. You see, the mouth moved, honey dripping from between the teeth. "I'm still here, still real, still alive. You can't kill me with smoke, can't dissolve me with potions. I've merged with the swarm on a cellular level. To kill me, you'd have to kill every bee in Chicago, every bee in America, every bee in the world." "Maybe not," Peter Chen said quietly. He'd been examining one of the broken amber chambers, studying the residue left behind. "Mr. Halloway, look at this." Thomas joined him, and Peter pointed to crystalline structures in the amber. "This isn't natural amber. It's synthesized, grown from the blood of the judged. And see these patterns? They're identical to what we saw in Dr. Harold's medical journal, The Crystallized Blood. Crow isn't just using the survivors as raw material. He's using them as a power source. Their transformed blood is feeding the reconstitution process. So if we destroy the blood supply," Thomas began, "we disrupt the process. Maybe even reverse it." Peter pulled out a small bottle from his coat, something he'd prepared before they left. Thomas realized, "This is a compound I've been working on. A chemical agent that should break down the crystalline structure of the transformed blood. If we can introduce it into the amber chambers, inject it directly into the system." Crow's skeletal form moved with horrifying speed, crossing the chamber in seconds, bees swarming around it like armor. "Clever boy, but too late." The form struck Peter, sending him flying across the room. The bottle shattered on the floor, its contents spreading uselessly across the honeycomb. "Peter!" Dr. Rosenthal ran to him, checking for injuries. The young man was conscious, but badly hurt, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. "I've spent 5 years rebuilding," Crow continued, his voice coming from both his mouth and the surrounding swarm. 5 years learning, adapting, preparing. Did you think I wouldn't anticipate your resistance? That I wouldn't plan for it? The floor beneath them suddenly gave way, not collapsing, but opening, like a mouth. They were falling through layers of honeycomb, sliding down a throat-like passage slick with honey, unable to stop or slow their descent. They landed in a chamber deep beneath the main building, splashing into a pool of honey 3 feet deep. The air here was suffocating, the smell of sweetness so intense that Thomas gagged. The walls pulsed with life, not just coated in honeycomb, but actually alive, breathing, watching them with what looked like clusters of compound eyes. "Welcome to my heart," Crow's voice echoed. "The true center of the hive, where the reconstitution actually occurs." And Thomas saw what he meant. This chamber was a womb, a factory, a nightmare. Dozens of cocoons hung from the ceiling, each containing a partially transformed human. But these weren't being preserved, they were being rendered down, dissolved, their essence extracted and fed into a massive pulsing sac at the center of the room. Inside that sac, barely visible through the translucent membrane, was a figure, humanoid, but perfect in a way that nothing natural should be. This was what Crow was becoming, not a man with bees, but a true hybrid, the final merger of human and hive. Beautiful, isn't it? Crow's skeletal form descended from above, suspended on threads of amber. "In another hour, the transformation will be complete. I'll be reborn, better than before, stronger, immune to your smoke, your potions, your desperate human tricks." And then the harvest begins in earnest. Not just Chicago, the world. Yekaterina had managed to hold on to one of her jars during the fall. She opened it now, and the smell that emerged was worse than the honey. Something rotten, something old, something that made the living walls recoil. "The death that ends death," she said, her voice steady despite their situation. "My aunt brought Queen's death to kill you, but I brought something older, something that destroys not just the body but the very concept of the thing. If I can get this into your womb, into that sack, you can't," Crow gestured, and the honey they stood in began to rise, became viscous, grasping. It was alive, pulling at their legs, trying to drag them under. "You're going to be part of my rebirth. Your essence, your memories, your strength. I'll consume it all." Thomas felt the honey pulling at him, felt it trying to force its way into his mouth, his nose. Beside him, Doctor. Rosenthal was struggling, starting to sink. Peter was unconscious, his broken arm unable to help him stay afloat. They were going to die here. Drowned in sweetness, dissolved, made part of Crow's obscene rebirth. But then, Thomas remembered something. Something Margaret had said in her last moments. "There's nothing inside anymore. They hollowed me out." Crow needed essence to feed his reconstitution. He needed souls, consciousness, the ineffable thing that made people human. But Thomas had already given that to Margaret's memory, to his guilt, to his grief over the past 5 years. He was hollow too, in his own way, empty. And you can't consume emptiness. Thomas stopped fighting. He let the honey cover him, let it flow into his mouth and lungs. He felt it probing, searching for something to extract, something to harvest, and finding nothing. The honey recoiled. "What?" Crow's voice was confused. "What are you?" Thomas emerged from the honey, gasping but somehow unaffected. "Nothing," he said. "I'm nothing. You already took everything from me 5 years ago. There's nothing left for you to harvest." And in that moment of Crow's confusion, in that brief instant when the hive's attention was focused entirely on Thomas, Yekaterina moved. She ran across the surface of the honey, impossible, but she did it anyway, her feet barely touching the surface, her movements almost bee-like in their precision. She reached the central sac in seconds and plunged her jar deep into the membrane. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The sac began to dissolve, the figure inside screaming not with sound, but with a psychic wail that Thomas felt in his bones. Living walls convulsed. The honey boiled, and Crow's skeletal form collapsed, the bees that held it together scattering in panic. "No!" The voice was purely human now, weak, mortal. "No, I was so close. Centuries of planning, centuries of work." The chamber was coming apart, the entire hive structure destabilizing. Thomas grabbed Dr. Rosenthal with one hand and Peter with the other, dragging them toward what he hoped was an exit. Yekaterina was there too, guiding them through the collapsing nightmare. They emerged into a basement corridor, honey and wax raining down around them. Behind them, they could hear Crow's final screams. "This isn't over! I'll return! I always return! The bees remember! They always remember! Maybe," Yekaterina said, pulling out one more jar. "But they won't remember this." She threw it back into the chamber. And this time the explosion was real, not fire, but something else. Light, pure and blinding, that seemed to erase rather than destroy. Thomas watched as the entire hive structure simply ceased to exist, dissolving into nothingness, taking with it Crow's consciousness, his memories, his very pattern. The bees that had formed his body scattered into the night, but they were just bees now. Simple insects, with no coordination, no intelligence beyond their natural instincts. The survivors who had been in the amber chambers stumbled out of the collapsing building, confused but alive, the transformation reversing as Crow's influence finally, truly ended. By the time the fire department arrived, summoned by concerned neighbors who'd seen the strange lights, there was nothing left of Thornton and Sons but rubble and a lingering smell of honey. 3 months later, Thomas stood in a cemetery overlooking Lake Michigan, placing flowers on Margaret's grave. The headstone was simple: Margaret Halloway, wife, hero, free. "I kept my promise," he said quietly. "He's really gone this time." Yekaterina made sure of it, burned every cache we could find, destroyed every seed, every backup hive. There's nothing left of Silas Crow but stories. He paused, listening to the wind, half expecting to hear that familiar hum. But there was only silence and the distant sound of waves on the shore. "The survivors are doing better. Dr. Rosenthal says their blood chemistry is returning to normal. Most of them don't even remember being judged, being part of the hive. Their minds have protected them by forgetting. Maybe that's for the best." A bee landed on Margaret's headstone. Just one, small and golden in the afternoon sun. Thomas watched it crawl across the engraved letters of her name, and he felt no fear, just sadness and a strange kind of peace. "I miss you," he whispered, "every day. But I'm glad you're free. Glad you're at peace." The bee took flight, disappearing into the blue October sky. Thomas walked back through the cemetery, past rows of graves, toward the street where Yekaterina was waiting in his path. Automobile. She'd stayed in Chicago to help with the cleanup, to make sure no traces of Crow's influence remained. In a week, she'd return to New York, but Thomas knew they'd stay in contact. The network of beekeepers was growing, watching, making sure that what Crow had tried to do would never happen again. "How are you feeling?" she asked as he got in. "Empty," Thomas admitted. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe emptiness is better than being full of grief and rage. My aunt used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go," Yekaterina said. "You loved your wife. That love doesn't disappear just because she's gone." They drove through Chicago's streets, and Thomas looked at the city with new eyes. How close it had come, twice now, to being consumed. How many people walked these streets with no idea of the horrors that had almost transformed them into something inhuman. But they were safe now. The swarm was truly dead, its memory erased, its power broken. Or so Thomas hoped. That night, alone in his house on Blackwood Street, the house he'd never been able to bring himself to leave, Thomas sat in his study and opened Elena's journal one last time. Yekaterina had given it to him as a gift, trusting him to preserve its knowledge. He flipped through the pages, reading accounts of other bee speakers, other harvests, other battles fought across centuries. And on the last page, in Elena's careful handwriting, he found a final entry dated the day before she'd gone into Crow's hive. "If you're reading this, I am dead. But know this, the fight is never over. The bee speakers are manifestations of humanity's desire to perfect itself, to erase its flaws through transformation. As long as humans fear their own darkness, as long as they seek easy answers to hard questions, the bee speakers will return in new forms. But also know this, As long as there are people willing to fight, willing to resist, willing to accept that humanity's flaws are part of what makes us human, the bee speakers will never win. We are messy, imperfect, contradictory creatures. And that is our strength, not our weakness. Guard this knowledge. Pass it on. And when the next bee speaker rises, and they will rise, be ready, Thomas closed the journal and looked out his window at the quiet street. Lights glowed in windows. Families sat down to dinner. Children played in yards. Ordinary life, beautiful in its imperfection. And somewhere in the city, in 1,000 homes and apartments and tenement rooms, bees built their hives. Simple creatures following ancient instincts, making honey, pollinating flowers, going about their business with no supernatural intelligence, no malevolent consciousness guiding them, just bees. Thomas smiled. For the first time in 5 years, he felt something like hope. The swarm was dead, the city was safe, and tomorrow he would wake up and continue the work of protecting it, of watching for signs that the old evil might return, of honoring Elena and Margaret's sacrifice by refusing to let their deaths be in vain. He was a guardian now, a beekeeper in the old sense, watching over both the hives and the humans, making sure the two remained separate, distinct, safe from each other. It was a heavy burden, but he would carry it. For Margaret, for Elena, for all the souls that Crow had consumed, all the lives that had been saved. Outside his window, the autumn wind stirred the trees, and if there was a hum in that wind, it was only the sound of the city breathing alive, imperfect, free. December 1915. The letter arrived on a cold winter morning, delivered by a courier rather than the regular post. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately, Yekaterina's distinctive script, precise and careful. Thomas, it read, I pray this letter finds you well. I am writing with troubling news. 3 days ago, a colleague in San Francisco sent word of a new beekeeper who has appeared in the city. He calls himself Solomon Wax, and he distributes honey that he claims can cure any ailment, heal any wound. The pattern is familiar, too familiar. I know we destroyed Crow. I know his consciousness was erased. But Elena's journal spoke of something we may have overlooked, the memory in the honey. The idea that Crow's pattern, his knowledge, his methods, might have been preserved not in his physical form, but in the honey itself. In the thousands of jars he distributed over decades, hidden in cellars and attics and forgotten storage rooms. If someone were to find such honey, to consume it, they might inherit more than just a taste for sweetness. They might inherit the knowledge of how to become a bee speaker. The pattern could be reborn in a new host. I am traveling to San Francisco to investigate. If my fears are confirmed, I may need your help. The network is strong, but we are few, and the world is large. Stay vigilant, my friend. Watch for signs. And if you encounter honey that seems too perfect, too beneficial, too good to be true, destroy it, burn it, bury it deep where no one will ever find it. The swarm may be dead, but its memory lives on. And memory, as we both know, can be the most dangerous thing of all. Thomas set down the letter and walked to his window. Outside, Chicago was covered in fresh snow, clean and white and pure. The city slept peacefully, unaware of the shadow that had almost consumed it, unaware of the eternal vigilance required to keep such shadows at bay. He thought of Crow's final words. The bees, remember. They always remember. Perhaps he had been right. Perhaps evil like that never truly died. It just waited, dormant, for the right conditions to bloom again. But if that was true, then good must be equally persistent. Memory worked both ways. As long as there were people who remembered what Crow had tried to do, people who remembered Margaret's sacrifice and Elena's courage, people willing to stand against the darkness, then the light would endure. Thomas pulled out paper and pen and began to write a response to Yekaterina. He would help her. Of course he would help her. This was his burden now, his purpose, perhaps the reason Margaret had died, to pass this knowledge on, to ensure that someone stood guard against the return of the bee speakers. As he wrote, a single bee crawled across his desk. Thomas paused, watching it, wondering if it was just an insect or something more. But it simply wandered for a moment, then flew to the window and disappeared into the white winter morning. Just a bee. Thomas returned to his letter, his pen scratching across the paper, writing the words that would begin the next chapter of his story, the next fight, the next vigil. The Beekeeper of Blackwood Street was dead, but the guardians who opposed him lived on. And that, Thomas thought, would have to be enough. You've just survived the tale of Silas Crow and the harvest that nearly consumed Chicago. From the gaslit streets of Blackwood Street to the honeycomb horrors of Thornton and Sons, you've walked alongside Detective Thomas Halloway through 3 episodes of supernatural terror. If this story gave you chills, please subscribe for more historical horror tales from forgotten corners of America. Like if the Beekeeper's Nightmare kept you reading. Share with anyone who appreciates dark, atmospheric horror. Comment below, which episode terrified you most, and would you have accepted crow's honey?